In most Western democracies, the young are what you could call an oppressed minority. In societies shaped by the voting weight of the oversized baby boomer generation, they're burdened with high taxes and the task of paying back or at least paying interest on high levels of debt as well as pensions. Just take a look at Italy, a country where pension spending sits at 14% of GDP, or Spain, which announced an additional solidarity contribution from high earners to help pay for its pension system. Young people and workers are effectively paying a boomer tax, as a larger and larger share of the economy ends up financing pensions and elderly care. And it's putting pressure on the social contract across the West, as young workers are being asked to finance welfare states that are increasingly geared away from them and towards the elderly. Fully aware of these difficulties, some countries like Denmark have started advertising themselves as the best countries for young people, and they've actively been trying to get young people like me and perhaps you to move there. So I wanted to understand how aging is affecting Western societies, how big this boomer tax actually is, and what it might mean for young people in the coming decade as we reach peak boomer, the moment when all baby boomers enter retirement age. And with all this information, we can actually answer the question of what is the best country in Europe for young people. So over the course of a lifetime, people first consume more than they produce. Then, as they reach their prime working years, they produce more than they consume. And once again, as they age, they end up consuming more when they stop working. When we're children, much of that cost is borne by our parents, who provide shelter, food, and clothing, though society tends to make it easier on them by reducing their taxes and providing public services like daycare and free education. In fact, when the boomers were growing up, they posed a similar problem to the one they're posing now. Their outsized generation needed to be paid for by a small population of workers. One way we can look at this is through the age dependency ratio, which gives us an idea of how many workers there are by country. That number was sky high in the 1960s and fell as the boomers came of age in the 1970s and 80s, before ticking back up since the late 2000s across the developed world as the boomers started to retire. But while parents mostly are responsible for their children, we can ask ourselves, who's paying for all these old people? In other words, how do the elderly get by in different countries? Well, for most wealthy countries, the main source of elderly income is actually in the form of public transfers in the form of pension payouts. For most European countries, public transfers make up an overwhelming majority of the income per capita of old people, whereas in Anglo-Saxon countries and the Netherlands, there was a significant contribution from private pension funds, while Asian countries like South Korea and Japan, as well as the US, saw a higher share of income from work as the elderly are pushed to work longer. And so the best way we can take a look at the boomer tax is by looking at how much social spending is given out to the elderly. And public pensions are not the only way governments help old people get by. Healthcare expenditure is directed primarily at older people who are much more likely to need it. The reason we can also include government health expenditure here is because most of that spending happens after the age of 50, which is the age after which health really starts to decline. If we plot this on a graph, this is what we get. The Netherlands and Switzerland actually do pretty well here, since they mostly shifted to a privatized healthcare system, while others, like Central and Eastern European countries, pay less due to smaller pensions. At the far end of the spectrum, we have France, Italy, and Austria with the largest transfers to old people out of any country of the OECD. But I know what you might think here. What if there are more old people? Then it would be normal for us to pay more for their healthcare and pensions, right? Well, we can actually adjust for this by taking into account the share of people aged above 65. We end up with this scatter plot. On the far end of the spectrum, once again, are France, Italy, and Austria, who despite having smaller old populations than other countries, spend record amounts on pension spending, in part due to lower retirement ages. Japan, on the other hand, comes out as the champion of pension moderation. Despite the over 65 making up 28% of the population, it spent only 18% of its GDP on pensions, in part due to high employment rates amongst its elderly. And this is a burden that is basically paid for through the taxes on younger workers. And one way to reduce your tax burden aside from moving abroad as a young person is by starting your own business, which usually has some tax advantages. And that brings us to today's sponsor, Odoo, the all-in-one online business platform that helps you manage your whole business from accounting to web building on one platform. About 2 months ago, I created a website for InterEurope to share my scripts and sources all in one place. And I went to one of the most common web providers. But when Odoo reached out to sponsor this video, I jumped on the occasion to take advantage of their free website service. As I was piecing together the new InterEurope website, I found their web designer pretty intuitive, having all of the functionalities I needed to have it be the digital front end of InterEurope, aside from my face and the YouTube channel. All my sources and scripts are in one place, and I was directly able to save 16 euros a month on a monthly web provider subscription that I was paying for. Odoo offers a 1-year free custom domain and unlimited hosting and support, even on the one app free plan. What's even cooler is that if I want to expand into Europe's business digitally, I won't have to look further. I'll just be able to upgrade to one of their paid plans for less than the price of my previous website host in order to start a mailing list, newsletter, or an online web shop for Into Europe merch. So if you want to start a website, take a look at the amazing free website I was able to make with Odoo, check them out and see how they can help you reach your business goals. Now, back to the video. So the boomer tax is quite significant, but we can actually take this a step further and anticipate how much young people are expected to pay out in the future. Since most of the pension financing in Europe is from the government, we can actually see that Spanish households are actually entitled to payouts of 500% of GDP, while Austria, Italy, and France are pretty high as well. Whereas the Netherlands, Sweden, and Denmark, with their partially privatized pension systems, are actually doing quite a bit better than other European countries on paper. In fact, because of their diversification, these countries routinely top pension system sustainability rankings. Though it has to be said that the sustainability of their private system also remains to be seen. The economic slowdown that accompanies an aging population is reducing the returns of their pension investments. But the thing is, we can also take a look at how much money is actually headed to pensioners relative to the rest of the population. I ran the numbers with some OECD data and found that in some countries like France, Italy, or Spain, the median income for the population above the age of 65 relative to the working age population was near 100%. In other words, they had nearly the same income, though without working. In other countries like South Korea, Japan, the Netherlands, or Scandinavia, particularly Denmark, these were at a more reasonable 70%. But with the growing elderly population and significant pension entitlements to be paid out, it means that the burden will increase for the foreseeable future. And we might ask ourselves when we will reach the peak burden for the baby boomer generation. Well, here again, we have to turn to the old age dependency ratio, as well as the projections of the OECD. But do keep in mind that these are estimates of population over the course of decades and are subject to a lot of changes. However, all of these countries will end up at a higher base level than countries that have more favorable demographics, like the United States, France, or the United Kingdom, which by 2050 will have an old age dependency ratio similar to that of Japan today. But does that mean that the boomer tax will be as heavy on Western societies as it has been in Japan? Well, to answer that question, we have to understand that the boomer tax is a societal choice. That's because in a democracy, government spending can increase pretty quickly as a result of elections, with, for example, governments promising to raise pension spending in order to attract the votes of the elderly. In Switzerland, for example, pensioners outvoted young people to increase their own state pensions by a 13th month every year. But alternatively, societies could decide to ease the burden on younger generations by decreasing pension spending or raising the retirement age, something that the older generation in some countries have volunteered to do, while other countries meet these changes with protest. Japan is an example of a country that is aging relatively gracefully. It's spending more money on healthcare for its elderly population, but in return, it gets an elderly population that continues to contribute to the economy, sometimes into their late 70s. Others, like Denmark, have automatic ratchet clauses to increase their retirement age mathematically, and avoided protests in the process. So, what's the best country for young people? Well, according to all these graphs I just showed you, a young-friendly country is the one that is aware of the burden of an aging population and tries to lessen it by moderating pension sizes and pushing back the retirement age. And by that metric, the Scandinavian countries like Denmark, as well as the Netherlands, would come up on top, having lower living standards for their elderly and smaller pension contributions. Meanwhile, Italy, Spain, and France, with their rich pensioners and high boomer tax, are relatively bad for young people. But you might ask, so what? After all, it seems inevitable that as our societies age, spending on the elderly is bound to increase no matter what, as a result of pensions, but also of them cashing in on the assets they've built up over the course of their lives. Well, this video is a ranking. It's basically a list of countries according to solidarity between generations. If a country has a large young population but chooses to tax them to let the elderly retire early instead, the boomer tax will be far heavier than in an older country where older workers limit their pension spending by working longer. It also means that comparatively, if your country keeps taxes on young people and workers reasonable, in other words, moderates the boomer tax it claims, it could poach young people from other countries looking to escape the heavy tax burden. But that is a story for another time. This was Into Europe. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for the latest updates and analysis on European news. And if you like this video, then I would like to invite you to watch this video on Europe's housing crisis or this video on the demographics of immigration.